My name is Mary Splendorio, and on behalf of Apex Magazine and the Village of Canastota, we welcome you to the celebration, 110th celebration of the 1908 Great Race. We would really like to thank the village officials and the staff, and also Joe DiGiorgio from the Canal Town Museum in helping us arrange this whole event today. We couldn't have done it without their help. They are on a time crunch today because they have to be in Buffalo this afternoon for some big events, so this program will last about 40 minutes. And then there will be a presentation by Carla DeShaw, the mayor of Canastota, and then that will be over. So hopefully Jeff can keep it to that time frame. We really appreciate you guys all coming and making Canastota a stop on this adventure this next couple weeks, right? 3 weeks-ish across the United States. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Jeff Mahl.
Thank you, Sherry. I've got to say, this is overwhelming. It really is. And then when Bob told me this morning that you guys had a drone, I mean, we will never see that in any place we go except for here in Canastota. You guys are first class, top shelf. I couldn't appreciate it more. I guarantee you, we will never forget this. We will never forget this. Welcome. 110 years ago today, Greg Gramp was just outside of Berlin, headed for victory in Paris. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to just preface this with what I'm saying is that I was very fortunate. Greg Gramp lived to the age of 89. We lived in the same small town. I mean, it was Mayberry, RFD, upstate New York, just south of Buffalo in Springville, New York. So instead of watching Perry Mason and Gunsmoke, I would go up and listen to Greg Gramp. So a lot of what I'm telling you, I heard from the guy who actually did it, which is very, very, very fortunate. I didn't realize it so much as a little kid. It was like, Greg Gramp's talking about this race again. Well, I want to go out and play ball. But when I was 14, I had an English teacher who gave an assignment. Friday, there was a big paper due, okay? And the subject was open. We could write on what we wanted. Well, I was 14. So I don't even think about the paper until Thursday night. And it's like, what in the world am I going to write about? I was under the crunch. And I thought, well, I could write about this race. And I got an A+ on the paper. And even at 14, it dawned on me, wow, people think that this is good stuff, and it's an easy A. So from that time on, I paid attention.
She was only A+.
Well, yeah, when I was really desperate, I pulled the rabbit out of the hat and got another A+. But we're going to talk a little bit about why Greg Gramp, it was important to him, Canastota, and he often talked about it. You will see as the story unfolds how unbelievable, and most people even today cannot imagine anybody doing this. And you have to remember that this was at a time when there were no snow plows, no antifreeze hadn't been invented, and they were driving from New York City across upstate New York in the middle of February. And they had to do it. People say, well, why didn't they do it in the summertime? And it was simple. They were going to drive from Times Square to the Eiffel Tower. Well, there's that little thing in between called the Pacific Ocean. They had to start in February because they were going to drive across the frozen Bering Strait. Kind of makes ice road truckers look wimpy, what these guys were going to do 110 years ago. So we're going to just take a little look at the story. This actually is the Thomas Flower. It's not Greg Gramp in the car, although he was in the car after the restoration. We'll talk about that for a moment in this video. I might also add, too, that this video was made when the Thomas Flower was inducted into the National Historic Vehicle Register.
This automobile has a story. This automobile tells an epic story.
Accomplishments like this allow us to be where we are today. This is the 1907 Thomas Flower Model 35. This car matters because it won the legendary New York to Paris race in 1908, and it changed forever the image of the automobile. It's especially important to me because George Schuster, driver and winner of that race, was my great-grandfather. In 1908, the automobile was considered a novelty for the rich.
They're cantankerous, they're capricious, they're fragile, they're a real problem. But it's the future, and some people do see that.
A proposed race was discussed, and the premise was really simple. Begin the race in New York City and head west, crossing the North American continent with the idea of using the frozen Bering Strait as an ice bridge over the Pacific, then the Asian continent, then the European continent, finally ending at the Eiffel Tower in Paris. No automobile had ever crossed the United States in the wintertime. Most everyone agreed none of the cars would get past Chicago. But you have to remember who the president was in 1908, a fellow by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. There was no way that he was going to have Europeans crossing the United States without having a U.S. representative in the field. This was a matter of national pride.
The size, the gauge, and the power of the automobile is what enables it to make the trip. It's the only manufacturer that had the courage to put his name on the line. And that speaks volumes to E.R. Thomas. George Schuster was given 24 hours notice. Pack your bag, be in New York City. You're going to go around the world in an automobile.
In Times Square, he found 250,000 people to view the start of this race. The other competitors were there. One German, 3 French, and 1 Italian team. The journey was as impossible as many had viewed.
They started in a blinding snowstorm back in February, and they're ending right in the middle of summer in Europe. The conditions alone would have been more than most people can handle. George is the mechanic. He's the guy that knows more about the automobiles than anybody else.
In 1908, this was like going to the moon. At one point during the race, they actually hitched teams of horses and dragged the Thomas through snowdrifts, measuring their progress in feet per hour. They finally reached San Francisco in 41 days, 8 hours, and 15 minutes. When they reached Alaska, they encountered 10 feet of snow. So they redirected all of the teams to go by ship across the Pacific, then crossing Japan, finally entering Asia proper in Vladivostok. In the back seat of the Thomas Flyer was a New York Times correspondent. He had to file his story every day. Well, ships in those days didn't have telegraph. He would tie the story around the leg of a carrier pigeon who would fly back to Seattle. The telegrapher would key the story back to New York City, and that would be front page news the next morning. By that time, they were down to 3 teams: the German Protos, the Italian Zust, and the Thomas Flyer. Danger was always a factor. The mud was so deep that horses would actually drown, and yet these 3 teams had to maneuver through those obstacles. This was an everyday, horrendous, beyond belief effort.
This plank originally stretched the entire length of the automobile on both sides. And they carried this in order to be able to ford streams, to get over soft ground or snow. They would be able to throw these planks out ahead of the automobile and get traction and get back out of the holes.
And a very famous moment during the race, the German team became stuck in the quagmire. The Thomas pulled around in front, tossing the Germans their rope to pull them out of their predicament. The German team captain opened a bottle of cognac, and the 2 teams toasted each other in the vastness of Siberia. They continued on to Berlin, and finally, on the 30th of July, entered the city gates of Paris. A gendarme, Parisian policeman, noticed the left front headlight. That had been broken by an unfortunate pigeon south of Moscow. Parisian regulations requires that automobiles must have 2 functioning headlights. George turned to the policeman and he said, "I have just come 169 days, 22,000 miles, I can see the Eiffel Tower, and you're telling me that I can proceed no further?" A Parisian bicyclist said, "I have a lamp on my bicycle, you can put it on your autocar." George couldn't remove the lamp from the bicycle, so he hoisted the bicycle with the lamp on the hood of the Thomas Flyer. The Thomas Flyer crossed the finish line to win the New York to Paris race with a bicycle on its hood. The Flyer and its team were given a hero's welcome in New York. The mayor said to George, "There's someone else who would like to meet you." So they hopped in the Thomas Flyer and went to meet the president. Teddy Roosevelt actually did sit behind the driver's wheel. He looked at George and he said, "I like people who do things, not the good man who stays at home." After the conclusion of the race, the Thomas Flyer fell out of public view for many decades. It was not until 1963, a man by the name of William F. Harrow purchased what he thought was the Thomas, bringing it back to his museum in Sparks, Nevada.
He immediately gets on the phone and he contacts Mr. Schuster and wants him to come out and verify the automobile. In order to do that authentication, they had completely disassembled the automobile.
George was very convinced that it was not the proper one. And there they noted three things. The initials MB carved into one of the seat frames by a carpenter when they added the fourth seat, a repaired clutch, which he had repaired just outside of Moscow, and a crack in the frame.
In Siberia, running along the railroad tracks, the frame gave up on them at this point. They get a piece of iron from a local rail yard, they bolt it all back together, they continue on the race. All these little bits and pieces and marks and personal items that nobody knew was there but George convinced him that this had to be the car that he took around the world.
The Thomas Flyer was actually laboriously restored to the smallest detail, but the finishing patina, the look, was the difficult part.
You pick a moment in time to bring that artifact back to. Usually it's considered the moment when brand new. To Mr. Harrow's credit, as a testament to what the machine and the men had accomplished, he picks the end of the race, that day when the automobile crossed under the Eiffel Tower. They took the car out into the desert outside of Reno and drove it in circles in the mud and the sagebrush to duplicate the wear and tear that should have happened over those months on the road. It tells that story of men and machines and adventure in a time when the world was changing.
George passed in 1972 at the age of 99. The story you've just heard, I heard many times growing up through my teens and early 20s. Today, I think it's as vivid a story and as compelling as it ever was. The Thomas victory established the fledgling American automotive industry on a par with the European manufacturers. Equally important, it convinced millions of people not only the versatility, but the reliability of the horseless carriage.
This automobile transported men around the world when most of the world said it couldn't be done. In my opinion, it could be the most important artifact in our museum. The automobile itself changes the world, but what this automobile proved is this lifestyle that comes with this machine is here to stay.
I'm Jeff Mahl, great-grandson of George Schuster, and this car matters. Now, as I mentioned, this video was made as part of the process of inducting the Thomas Flyer number 12 into the National Historic Vehicle Register. It's a very high-end club for vintage automobiles. The provenance has to be established, the historic significance has to be established, meticulous process that the car went through. The Thomas Flyer was actually brought to Allentown, Pennsylvania from the National Automobile Museum in Reno, Nevada, and was laser scanned for 2 days. And the idea was simple. These automobiles going into this designation have to be protected for hundreds of years into the future. And with that laser process, which I didn't know that much about 3D printing, but I talked with the technician. This is a joint project between the Smithsonian and the National Archives. These records are all stored. The digital record, the laser record, is actually capable, the technician told me, within 20 years, we'll be able to do this. They're building buildings now, multi-story buildings in China using using 3D printers. This process, when the technology is right, will allow them to recreate the Thomas Flyer right down to the fibers on the rope that you saw over the cowl. So if, like happened with all the Corvettes where they all went into the sinkhole, I don't know if you remember, down in Kentucky, and some of them were demolished, couldn't be restored. If that were to ever happen to any of the cars in the National Historic Vehicle Register, when the technology is right, and within the next 2 decades, he said, we'll be able to do this, they'll be able to rebuild the Flyer. So this is preserved. All of the documentation, the paper documentation, I said, well, what about the paper? Because this is all kept in the National Archives. What about the paper? He said the paper that all of this is printed on has a shelf life of 400 years. So the idea is what this car accomplished which was way more than winning the race. I mean, this changed things for all of us. Actually, it's going to be documented now, and I'll also add too the fact that George was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. So today, his name is right next to Henry Ford and Ransom Olds, who refused to enter a car in this race, an American car, their American car, into this race, because they said it's impossible. None of the cars will get past Chicago. So it's wonderful to see George's name right next to the two guys who said this couldn't be done. The human side of this story is so amazing, and we'll get into the little more of the local aspect of it. But when they told about it, I don't know if you caught it, the 24 hours notice, he was in Providence, Rhode Island demonstrating cars. He got a call from ER saying that ER wanted him in New York City the next morning. He was chief mechanic for the company. So George said, well, what is it you want me to fix? And no, no, no. We want you to drive a car around the world tomorrow morning. He was due home. My great-grandmother, Rose, was home with her young son, George Jr., my grandfather, 4 years old, expecting him to be home. And he said, well, you know, dear, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to make it home this weekend. And she said, oh. And she said, well, you know, why? And he said, well, I'm going to drive a car around the world. And you got to remember, this is at a time nobody had ever driven across the United States. And he said that there was kind of a long pause, and then she asked him, well, how long will that take you? And he said, I really don't know. And he said then there was even a longer pause, and she simply said to him, George, I'll pray for you. Now, I don't know if wives would be quite that understanding today, you know, where, honey, I don't know when I'm going to be home or exactly where I'm going, and I'll pray for you. But that's the way it was in 1908. The advances from this race, historians point to the fact that because America won, it changed the perception. The way people thought about automobiles in 1908, a quote from the London Daily Times when this race was being proposed. It must be remembered that the automobile is the most fragile and capricious thing on earth next to a woman. That's how people thought about something that's part of our everyday life. We couldn't imagine not having our car. But in those days, this was a toy for rich people. Well, after this race, everybody understood, hey, you could actually drive these things in the winter. Nobody drove a car in the winter. You could actually, if you wanted to, drive across the United States, and if you wanted to, you could drive around the world. Well, everybody wanted it, but the Thomas Fire cost $5,000. More than a house cost. You have to multiply that by 25 to come up with today's value. Nobody could afford it. July the 30th, George won this race. October of 1908, you car guys and gals know that Henry Ford introduced the Model T. 1/10 the cost of the Thomas Fire. So now people trusted it, they could afford it. The problem was no paved roads. 5 years later, the first transcontinental highway, 1913, was the Lincoln Highway, was paved. So a lot of historians say all of this would have eventually happened, but this is what really gave it a shot in the arm. So Henry not being in the race, you know, was obviously benefited by the race. And he had a ready market. He didn't have to convince anybody that the car was a good idea. All he had to do was to make it affordable, which he did. And the rest is history. Coming up from New York, they came up Route 9 along the east side of the Hudson. And probably all of you have driven Route 9 a million times, okay? Came up through Hyde Park. Now, it was very significant yesterday. We started this event in Hyde Park. And for two simple reasons. The Roosevelts, both FDR and Teddy, were very instrumental during this race. As they were driving up the morning of February 12th, there was a young driver, 25-year-old Monty Roberts. He was like the Jeff Gordon of the day. He was a real ladies' man, you know, and really a very good driver. Great-grandpa thought he was a great driver. But he had promised to come back to do something called the Briarcliff race which is held, and I see a lot of nods, everybody knows about the Briarcliff. So he had to actually depart the race team in Cheyenne to get back in time to do the Briarcliff. That left Great Gramp in total charge of the car. He started out as a mechanic, and he actually was the only American who actually went from Times Square to the Eiffel Tower. But Monty came back. So as they were driving past the FDR estate in Hyde Park, and I'm sure many of you have visited that, Monty turns over, because Great Gramp in those days, you drove on the right-hand side of the road, and he looked across to the left, which is where the estate is, Springwater, I believe, the FDR estate. And he said the year before, he had taught FDR, who was a student at Harvard, how to drive his father's Thomas Flyer. James Roosevelt, FDR's dad, had a Thomas. And so Monty actually went up there to teach young FDR how to drive. Of course, Teddy, as was mentioned in the story, is really the reason that any American team entered. He actually knew E.R. Thomas, and Great Grandpa always said he suggested to E.R., but in those days, Teddy didn't suggest. You know, it was like if Teddy thought something was a good idea, guess what? You'd die trying to do it. And matter of fact, Great Grandpa had two heroes in life, Teddy Roosevelt and John Wayne. Okay? Gives you a little idea of how he looked at things, looked at the world. But this was very typical. Remember, no snowplows, right? So hooking teams of horses was, you know, they covered an awful lot of ground, not only in New York State. The worst recorded, since they kept records, in history around the Great Lakes happened in February of 1908. So this was, today, by today's standard, people would have said, forget it, you know. I can't get out of my driveway, much less get across to Chicago. This was an incredible photograph. I believe that this came from Joe, right? I'd never seen this photograph, and to me this is the best thing about what we do. We come to the towns along the route, and folks come up and they say, hey, you know, I've got this. Sometimes it's been in my attic for years. I think my grandfather, great-grandfather had it, and they'll show it to me, and I'll say, wow, you know, this was actually something that either was a photograph of the race, or we actually found a jack that Great Gramp had lost in a snowbank along Lake Erie. He was changing a tire. They got lost it because it was blizzarding. He left behind the jack, and the great-grandson of the farmer who owned the farm where that snowbank was found it, knew the story behind it, passed it down through 3 generations. And he brought it in when we had the centennial in Springville, George's hometown. But this was the canal. Now, the significance of the canal. The snow was so bad that, you know how the towpath in most places, especially at that time, was higher than the surrounding ground. So what happened was the wind would blow the snow off the towpath. So for a lot of the route from Albany here, they ran the towpath where the mules were dragging the barges in those days. Well, of course, the water was frozen, so there were no barges, but they ran the towpath. The night they got to Canastota, they stayed in a hotel, which again, I just found, where we are seated today was the hotel they stayed in, okay? The next morning, they wake up, and it had sleeted. Well, it glazed the towpath, which had a crown in it, with glare ice. Now, what they were afraid of, the barge canal was frozen, but they were afraid that if they got this 5,000-pound car up on that crown, the slightest wrong move, where were they going to end up? In the barge canal. So from here, they took off through farmers' cornfields, orchards, backyards, front yards, barnyards, and then through the Montezuma swamps. Now you can imagine, even today, trying to go through the Montezuma swamps in the summertime with no roads. Imagine it in February, what it was like. He would get out, and they would go ahead of the car, and he had a long stick. And he would actually poke it down to see where the bottom of the snow was to figure out where they could go. All the way to Buffalo. All right? We think it's bad when we get held up in traffic, or for construction on the thruway going 70 miles an hour, and that's like your worst day. As I've told all of the folks who are traveling with us, our very worst day that we have on our way to San Francisco will be way better than the very best day they had in 1908. The marker that you have here, and we did a couple of photographs out in front, really kind of warms my heart because it was on the 14th of February, 2 days out of New York, that they stopped here and they made the course change. Now, it was a whole lot harder, but they reduced the risk of going into the barge canal. So, and Great-Grandpa often talked about Canastota. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the hotel. Maybe you can give me a picture of the hotel. I love it when you got a guy like Joe here who, is really into the story, and it's a great story because it's part of not my history, not our history, it's all of our history. When you get in your car, the next time you turn the key, you got to remember it was guys like George Schuster who got us to where we are. It just didn't happen without a whole lot of effort and a lot of sacrifice. A great example of the Yankee ingenuity that came into play here. Today, and this is one of the things I really feel strongly about, the one thing I never want to see us lose as Americans is our can-do attitude. It just bothers me that sometimes I think young people especially, grew up with the digital age. Nothing wrong with that. It's wonderful in a lot of ways. But sometimes I often wonder if young people don't come away with the impression that, hey, if you can't Google the answer, there is no answer. The thing that was true and what built America was that can-do attitude. There's always an answer. And I'll give you a perfect example. They get to Alaska, right? 10 feet of snow. They're out on dog sleds. And there's no way you're going to drive a 5,000-pound car over 10 feet of snow. I don't care how much you shovel, because they were going to go up the Yukon River, across the Yukon River to Nome, and then over the frozen Bering Strait. So he was on a Wells Fargo dog sled. He goes back to the agent, and he comes to the pass, Thompson Pass. It's where the pipeline, the Alaskan pipeline, goes through today. Much wider today, but it was much narrower. And it was too narrow for the car. He says, well, that's no problem. We'll get dynamite. We'll blast it wide enough. And then the Wells Fargo agent says, well, there's 40 miles of forest and the trail's only wide enough for a horse and a sleigh or a wagon. That's no problem. We'll hire Eskimos to cut 40 miles of forest wide enough to get there. But then he said, well, George, he said, the Yukon River, and especially the frozen Bering Strait, and 110 years later, no four-wheel vehicle has ever driven across the frozen Bering Strait, freezes into pack ice. He says, we have trouble getting a dog sled out there. So George looks down at the dog sled, and then he says to the Wells Fargo guy, he says, well, how much will a dog sled carry? He says, well, a good musher and a good team of dogs will carry 600 pounds. That's it. I'm going to take the 5,000-pound Thomas Fire apart into pieces that weigh no more than 600 pounds. We're going to load it on dog sleds, and we're going to dog sled it across Alaska, across the frozen Bering Strait, and when I get to the frozen tundra of Siberia, I'll put it back together and drive to Paris. All right? He would have done it. He would have done it. But he telegraphed back to New York City, and it would have cost them $10,000 just to get to Fairbanks, which isn't even a quarter of the way across Alaska, which is $250,000, okay? And the race committee said, no, you've got to come back to Seattle and go by ship across, because they would have had to pay for all the teams to do that. Thank heavens he didn't do it, because he was just stubborn enough. He'd have gotten out in the middle of frozen Bering Strait, where the deadliest catch guys go fishing. He'd have broken through the ice, and I wouldn't be here today. So, thank you. Thank you. Whoever made that decision, thank you.
Hey, can I say something?
Yes, sir.
Okay. that sign was maybe responsible for David Sadler, the village historian. He's the one who got it here. And Dave's sitting with us right here.
Well, I'll tell you, thank you, gentlemen, sincerely, thank you for that. Because future generations wouldn't have a clue what happened in towns like this, small town America. That's where I grew up, you know. That's where we all grew up. And they wouldn't have any idea if it weren't for things like this, and if it weren't for the historians and the people with a sense of history. And I think that's why we do a lot of what we do, is to pass it on to the next generation. One of the people who's going to be with us in Buffalo is a young fellow named Jack, and he's the son of my niece. So he is George's great, great, great grandson, 2.5 years old. All right. So this sense of history, I hope we're good into the 22nd century now with young Jack carrying on the story. But it's so important to encourage young people to establish this connection with their past. Again, Joe already knows what I'm going to say. If you look at the back of that, of the Thomas Flyer, circled there, you're going to notice tire chains on there. Well, what in the world does tire chains have to do with this whole story? Well, turns out a lot. Those tire chains are weed tire chains. Now, those of you familiar with the history of Canastota know that, I don't remember his first name. Harry. Harry Weed was from where? Canastota. He invented those tire chains. All right? And so there was a very direct connection. And as a matter of fact, they so impressed Great Gramp that he wrote a testimonial to the Weed Chain Company, okay, which was Harry's invention, telling that world that they would have never won if it wasn't for Weed Chain. Okay? So Canastota, in a lot of ways, not only in the direction the vehicles took, but in the fact that they made it at all, was largely due to Canastota. So you've got a real direct connection. Now, the fellow next to it is also significant. His name is Charlie Dupuy. And Charlie was 19 years old. He was the photographer for the New York Times. The New York to Paris race was front page news on the New York Times for 6 months. And it was one of the most photographed events in the early 1900s. Now, Charlie was single at that time, and so New York Times thought, well, hey, he can go. He doesn't have a wife to say yes or no. You know, he'd be good for this. We're so fortunate today, we talk about history and legacy and how important this is. We actually have with us today Charlie's grandson, Wayne. Stand up, Wayne, so that they... It was his granddad who took some of the pictures of my great-granddad going around the world, especially across the United States. Charlie was with him through the United States to San Francisco. And the fact that it is so well documented is largely due to Charlie. So a very important role and a strong connection with where we are here today. When we come to where we are today, okay, the New York to Paris. We started out the 19th down in Hyde Park, and we're making our way through to San Francisco. We'll be in San Francisco, and it's only 3,500 miles in a 90-year-old vehicle. What's the problem? This is easy. Piece of cake. Now, the original plan was we were going to be in Paris by Halloween this year. Along in December, we came to the point where we had to make a go or a no-go decision on this for visas and hotels and all of that. Well, if you remember in December, there was a big conversation going on in the world about who had the bigger button. And for a lot of people, there was a major concern. Now, where we enter, we were going to drive the original route, going across Japan, and where we enter Asia is a place called Vladivostok. And guess where Vladivostok is? On the northern border of North Korea. All right? So a lot of folks said, you know what? there's probably going to be a better time for you guys to do this than this year. Here we are today, what, 6 months later, and we still don't really know what's going to happen. It looks hopeful, and I think we all hope that this thing comes to a good, peaceful conclusion. But believe me, in December, it was looking pretty bleak. So in any event, the plan is we're going to go just as we originally scheduled across the U.S. this year. And then when the world finally gets its act together, we'll continue the rest of the way to do the Asia and the European leg. When we, let's see, there is, so that you can kind of keep up with where we're going, there is a website, very simple, 2018ny2paris.com. Tells a lot of the history, a lot of connections to what we're doing, why we're doing it, and most importantly is this big blue blog button. Now, what I'm trying to do, and as a matter of fact, I'm very fortunate, where's Frank? Frank is going to drive the next leg to our next fuel stop so that I can do the blog for yesterday. We've got an awful lot of people following it, and like if I miss, or if I'm a couple hours late, it's like, what happened, But pretty much every day from now until July the 5th, we'll be doing postings on there. So if you want to keep up with us, and guess who I'm going to mention in tomorrow's blog? Canastota, okay? So we'll tell a little bit more to the world about this story that's happening here right now. Now the blog is real easy. You just push that button, and it'll take you right to this page, and you'll see it all listed down there. So it's 2018ny2paris.com, and a real easy way to keep up with all the great things. And believe me, we're going to say a lot of great things. Matter of fact, if I can get some of that drone, because I can do the video in there, we'll include that in the. Maybe that'll inspire. We've got some big events in Buffalo and Cheyenne. They're bringing the cowboys out, and the mayor and the governor's even talking about taking a ride into town with us. So, of course, it's easy because that's the state capital. So it's like he sees us out of his window, and he'd want to know what was going on anyway. And then, of course, we'll be in Evanston, which is big rodeo time out there, and then Reno. We are going to stop, even though that wasn't on the original route, we are going to stop at the National Automobile Museum in Reno and see the Thomas Flyer. That's where it is today. And if you're ever out in Reno, Bill Harrah, of course, made his millions in gambling, Harrah's casinos, but his true love was automobiles. At the time he acquired the Thomas Flyer, he had 700 in his personal collection. At the time of his passing, he had 1,500 in pristine condition, factory condition. He wouldn't exhibit it unless it was perfect. One exception out of that 1,500 cars was the Thomas Flyer, which was restored to the condition it was when it entered Paris. And I've got the audio recording. And there was actually a little bit of an argument between Bill Harrah and Great Graham, because Bill Harrah was going to restore it like all his other 700 cars. Great Graham said that would be a mistake. He said the importance of the Thomas Flyer is not how it started the race in New York, but how it won the race at the Eiffel Tower. And so Bill made one exception. His people couldn't bring themselves to do anything less than perfect. So guess what? He hired Walt Disney to come in, and he was very much involved with the restoration of the Thomas Flyer. Because believe me, Disney knows how to make things look like they're supposed to look. And when you see the Flyer today, it'll be right down to the broken left front headlight in that car. So incredible detail. I don't know how we're doing for time. Wow, that's amazing, Jack. I never did that.
One thing I want to mention that Jeff had talked about how you can Google everything today, and I think it's pretty cool because I know when we were starting all this, one of the things Bob, I think, found on Google, which was YouTube, was there was a George Schuster was on To Tell the Truth television show, and if you Google that, it was so cool, and the people trying to guess what he had done. How old was he? 80?
He was 85 years old.
85 when he was on To Tell the Truth, and so Google that. That's pretty cool. Carla Deshaw, the mayor of Canastota, is going to do a short presentation.
We hope we have a question time for him.
Do we have time for a couple of questions?
That's up to you.
It's up to you, Jeff. I mean,
You can take
We can take a couple, sure. We'll just eat fast.
I'll just ask you one. Not to correct you, but in 1904, Franklin did across the United States. I wonder if our historical-
Summertime. There were 6 people who did it before George did it, but he was the first person to ever drive across the United States in the wintertime, which was considered impossible.
Definitely.
Up to that, but yes, you're absolutely right. Horatio Nelson did it, and Inowinton was the very first guy to do it, was Inowinton. But that was in the midst of summer.
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, let me just add to that. In 1903, after the Whitman, was the Curved Dash Olds and the Packard, the old Pacific Packard. And in 1904, the fellow that drove the Curved Dash Olds drove the Franklin and did it in 30 days. In 1903, it took him 60 days. And the Winton also, all 3 were above 60.
And Horatio did it on a bet. I think it was $25, was it?
Yeah, when the other
50? It was 50. But he did it on a barroom bet, you know? Yes, sir.
The Italians in Canastota might like to know what happened to the Italian part.
Well, as funny you should ask. They could never figure out why the Italians were trailing all the way across the United States. Because it wasn't like today where there was instant television and everything. All they had was the newspaper, right? And the Italian kids were 19 and 20s, in their early 20s. Antonio Scarpaglio was the son of a very wealthy Napolese newspaper man, and actually was a gifted writer. I mean, he sort of wrote his memoirs almost in verse. I mean, you could read that thing forever. And Great-Grandpa got an interpreted version of his memoirs, and they found out the reason for the delay. It seems that the reason for the delay was the young Italian lads and the young American girls accounted for the vast majority of those delays crossing the United States. They got to California, and Antonio says when they were going up past the almond groves, and they were in bloom, and Antonio says the blooming almond trees and the young American ladies in their long white flowing dresses, every member of the Italian team had decided that they were going to quit the race, live the rest of their life in California. They were very taken by the American girls. So I will say though, better judgment and sense of duty overtook that impulse, which was very strong apparently in the writing of young Antonio. And they did make it. There were 3 teams out of the 6, which is miraculous that 3 out of the 6 actually made it to Paris. The Germans were actually there 4 days ahead of time, but they had cheated. This was a military operation for the Germans, so they were going to do whatever it took to get there. And they had actually loaded their train in Idaho and shipped it by Union Pacific Railroad to the West Coast. Well, they were all German military, so naturally they're going to camouflage the car so nobody would know that the Protos was on the Union Pacific Railroad. Well, all the railroad guys knew what it was, so they reported back to New York they were disqualified. They were reinstated with a 15-day penalty, another 15 days on top of that. So they would have had to beat the Americans by 30 days. America was declared the victor by 26 days in that race. The Italians didn't make it in, I'm sorry to tell you, didn't make it in until September the 13th. So they were quite far behind. And I don't know whether it had to do with the Siberian girls or what. They struggled.
Well, historians arguably say that the Zeus, the Italian car, came in second because it did drive the whole route.
Well, that's, and you don't want to tell a German that. They got into Berlin, and that's where they found out that the Germans had just entered Paris that day. They were 4 days behind. They had no idea where anybody was. So they did. As a matter of fact, Lieutenant Hans Kuppen was captain of the team. This very distinguished man came up with a mustache and obviously military bearing. He was Lieutenant Kuppen's father. He was a colonel in the German army. And the Germans had very specific orders. Kaiser Wilhelm had 8 vehicles himself, and a lot of historians feel that the German entry was there not for a car race. This was to prove the viability of the automobile as a war machine. Everybody on that car was German military. Kuppen was on leave from the general staff in Berlin, okay? And his orders were specific. Win this race or don't bother coming home, okay? That was the hammer over his head on this whole thing. So it is true, the Germans took a lot of shortcuts, but there were penalties built in. So they were declared number 2, even with the penalties. The Italians also had a 15-day penalty because they didn't go to Alaska. The American Thomas Farr was the first vehicle ever in Alaska. The Wells Fargo guy, Great Gramp, says, well, how's the trail to Fairbanks? He says, well, this is the first automobile we've ever seen. I don't know what it can do. So that's how new this whole idea of an automobile was at that time. But the Italians did make it, and to their credit, they made it. And it was very well documented, but we really know what happened. We know the rest of the story, right? It's like Paul Harvey said.
Well, the Zeus still is restored today. It's in Canada.
In British Columbia.
British
Yeah,
Columbia.
as a matter of fact, we've seen it.
We did it, Pierce Howard Museum.
Yep. Yep.
There's an interesting story about pistols and the mechanic and the New York Times reporter. Would you tell that story?
Yeah, well, the first documented case of road rage. And it happened, they're driving along, Great Gramp's driving, and Hans Kuppen, who was a Norwegian ship captain, been on the French team first, couldn't deal with the French, so came over and joined the American team. Great Gramp thought it was a good idea because Hansen was actually born in Siberia, could speak Russian. So they're going along, driving along, and they get to this fork in the road, the classic fork in the road thing, right? And so Great Gramp's got a compass there, and he's looking at the compass, and he's saying, we should go to the right. Well, Hansen is there saying, no, 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 I know this area, I know this area. Go to the left. So Great Gramp says, okay, we'll go left. 3 hours later, there was nothing. And they finally come to this peasant, all right? So they asked the peasant which was the right road. Oh, it was the fork to the right. Great Gramp hears this. He turns to Hansen, and he says, when we get to the next train station, you're getting off this car, and you're going back. We don't need you anymore. Hansen, who was in the front seat, stood up, drew his pistol on Great Gramp, saying, you can't throw me off this car. In the back seat was George McAdam, who was the New York Times correspondent. He stands up, draws his pistol on Hansen, saying, put that down. You aren't fast enough to shoot him before I get you. First case of road rage. So if husbands and wives have a little squabble over, it's been going on for 110 years.
Pistols at home.
Nothing new. But yeah, a great story. Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to stand up here and thank a few people. Before I get into the presentation, there are a few people I want to recognize that are here today. One is our town supervisor, Rocky DeVeronica, in the back. Our second is our newly elected trustee, Bill Haddad, and his wife, Barbie. And I just have to stand up here and I have to take no credit for this event because I have such a phenomenal staff that have put this together. I kind of have empowered them to be who they are. And they're here today, and I just want to thank them wholeheartedly on making this happen. you know, I walk in, I get to see what's been done, and I get to do the presentation. But the credit all goes to Larry Carpenter, the village administrator, Kathy Williams, the treasurer, the staff upstairs, Karen and Irene, Joe DiGiorgio, our wonderful canal museum director, and so much more. David Sadler, our historian. Our police chief and the police that gave you the escort in today. Thank you very much. And Jackie, our photographer, who is always here with our photos, and George Puglisi, who had the drone. Thank you very much. So I've been mayor 6 years. I've lived here for a long time, 50-something years, 55 years. So I just want to say that we have a wonderful family in Canastota, and over the years what I've learned is that our family has an extended family. And that could be the Boxers, it could be people that have moved from here that still have a legacy or family here. And the Great Race is also part of our extended family. And your family and your great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-grandfather, he will always be cherished here. The Great Race will always be something we remembered. We've been really focused on putting our historical elements together in our village and our town because we are so much more than we ever knew. And I've learned a lot being mayor, and I think everybody here today has learned that as well. So I thank you for making us stop here and being at the old Weaver Hotel site. And it's been such a pleasure, and to watch the car come in was just so exciting. And you know, I think when it was either Larry or Kathy or somebody said to me, we're going to reenact the Great Race, I think my first question was, can I be in it? Because they all know how I drive. But yeah.
Contact button, that's what you need to hit.
Okay. Seriously. All right. Well, when I retire, I'm going to be hitting that button. But no, on behalf of my heart and the family that's here today and the residents and everyone, thank you so much. I have a special presentation for you that I'm going to read. So just sit tight for a second. So in recognition of the 110th anniversary of the Great Race of 1908, whereas in 1908, a race from New York City to Paris was launched in February of that year, and whereas the feat is considered to be equivalent of going to the moon, and whereas 6 teams from Germany, Italy, France, and the United States participated, and whereas the American car was driven by George Schuster of Springville, New York, and whereas the American team drove a 1907 Thomas Flyer manufactured in Buffalo, New York from New York City to San Francisco in 41 days. And whereas the American team encountered many hardships along the way, to include winter weather, lack of good roads, bandits, lack of accommodations, and numerous mechanical failures. And whereas weed tire chains, a Canastota invention, were credited with assisting the American team. And whereas after 22,000 miles and 169 days, the American team arrived in Paris to win the race. And whereas the Village of Canastota celebrates this historic event and our place in its history. And now therefore, as Mayor of Village Canastota, I do hereby recognize the significance of the Great Race of 1908 in America's and Canastota's history, and thank his great-grandson, Jeff Mahl, and the other participants for this recreation of the Great Race of 1908. Thank you very much.
I'm gonna have to build a bigger wall.
Well, this is a little recognition. You have to stand up. Just to wear or put in your drawer.
Oh, no. All this stuff has a very special place.
Just come over. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, this is the warmest welcome I think I've ever experienced. And We've been through a few of these. And I'll tell you, when it comes to class, Canastota has it. And it just is, and Bob and all of you who were a part of this, none of this comes easy, I know, but hopefully our stay here was informative and enjoyable for everybody, and one you'll long remember. Thank you very much.
And I just have one other presentation that is not on the agenda, but I do want to thank Bob and Sherry. And I have a little memento for you. It's a little village seal that you can either wear, pin on your bulletin board, or put in your drawer. So I want to thank you from the very first call I made to Bob, and I met Sherry today, and just speaking with Larry and how much work this has been and putting it all together. Could have never done it without you guys. So thank you very much.